Welcome to Grace this morning. My name is Daniel. I'm the director of our young adult ministry here at Grace. I'm really glad that you're here. Before we get into what we're going to talk about this morning, I just want to make you know a little bit about maybe who I am and part of the reason I'm up here this weekend. Before I was the director of young adult ministry here at Grace, I actually went through a couple internships here and even through our residency program for a few years, and have now been in the position that I'm in for the last few years. I am married. My wife and I are actually going to celebrate our third wedding anniversary later on this year. Great. She's worked really hard in our marriage. I've worked really hard in our marriage. We actually have a 10-month-old son. He just learned how to clap this week. He still has not learned how to sleep through the night. So pray for us. If I start to forget where I'm going, it's because I've had 10 months of not sleeping through the night. So for all of us though, man, I'm really glad that you're here this weekend. I think it'll be a good opportunity for you to be encouraged and also, honestly, for you to be challenged in some things as well. We're here in week 2 of a series that we're calling What Do You Believe, Really? And we're just going to jump right in this weekend. The goal of this series is this. You'll see it in your notes. To reveal the reality of the accuracy and tenacity around your beliefs. To reveal the reality around the accuracy and tenacity around your beliefs. Another way to say that is really to ask ourselves the question, to sit down, look in the mirror and say, what do I believe? Really, when it comes down to the end of the day, what is it that I really believe? And is what I believe actually the right thing to believe? And if it is the right thing to believe, how much do I actually believe it? Beliefs really drive all of our behavior in life. And so if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, then the things that we believe are super important. They're super important. They drive the behavior that we have, and God calls us to continue working out our salvation and growing in our faith with Him. And we can't do that if we don't believe the right things. Last weekend, if you were here, Keith kind of drew an illustration up on the screen to talk about what a Christian life growing towards God should really look like. And I'll say this, and Keith is my boss, so I need to be a little bit careful what I say. I think Keith gets an A+ in preaching and a D- in handwriting. He drew that chart up there last week, and I was like, Keith, nobody knows what that says. So I actually asked our production team to make a graph for us so that we all know what this looks like. If you're going to grow in your relationship with God, there's 2 things that you need to know. One is foundational to the Christian faith. It's that if you're going to grow as a Christian, you need to grow vertically in your personal relationship with Jesus. It's part of what we talked about last week, but it's a foundational thing. You can't be a better Christian if you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus. You can't look more like Christ if you don't have a relationship with Christ. But what's also true is that Jesus tells us as Christians, not only should we be concerned with our personal relationship with Him, but we should be connected to the thing that He tells us to be connected to. Jesus says that for the rest of eternity, however long until He comes back, He says the thing that I'm going to use to reach people and to further my message and further my kingdom, the thing that becomes the hope of the world, is the local church. And so as Christians, if we're going to look more like Christ, we care about our personal relationship with Him and growing in that way. And we also care about our commitment and dedication to the thing that He tells us to be about, which is the church. Keith said this last weekend, but we should be growing as Christians kind of up and to the right in this chart. We should ultimately find ourselves in kind of quadrant 2 and to continue growing in that place where we're dedicated to our personal relationship with God and our commitment to the thing that He tells us to be about. And one of the best ways for us to continue growing as we should as Christians is to hit the pause button, look in the mirror, and ask ourselves, what do we believe? What do we believe? And then to take it a step further and say, what do we believe really? So that's what we're doing every week in this series. We're going to look at kind of a foundational belief. We've said that Christianity has these things called orthodoxy. They're the beliefs that Christianity stops being Christianity if we do not believe them. And so this week we'll dive into another one, but it's really important for us to recognize why we're doing this. We're doing this, again, because our beliefs drive our behavior. Keith kind of used this phrase several weeks ago now, it might have been 2 or 3 weeks ago, where he was saying, what type of people should our church be full of? And the phrase that he used is really powerful. He said, our church should be full of good news people. good news people. That if we call ourselves Christians and we're going to go to a church and get plugged into a local church, then we should live lives that are about the good news. You know what the good news is. You've probably heard some of the good news before. The good news is that you're seen and loved by the God of the universe. That despite your sin, God made a way for you to spend eternity with him. That no matter who you are or what you've done, God offers you a chance at salvation. That God gives us life abundantly, peace beyond imagination, forgiveness of our sin, hope in a future, purpose in our life. That is part of the good news. But you can't be a good news person if you don't actually have the proper beliefs. In fact, I said it to you this way in your notes, that the good news begins with proper belief. That the good news begins with proper belief. That if you're going to be about the things that God calls us to be about, if you're going to be about the good news, you have to first back up and say, do I believe the actual right good news? Last week, Keith kicked off the series with a foundational belief in Christianity. He said that heaven and hell are a real place. And there's only one way to get to heaven, and his name is Jesus. Pretty much what Keith said last week is there is one train going to heaven, and it's not the Polar Express, it's the Jesus train. And Jesus is leaning out of the train saying, toot, toot, all aboard, come on, get on board the Jesus train. Partly because he wants us, and he wants to be in a relationship with us, but also because he knows there's no other way for us to get to heaven. That he is the only way. He is the only train leaving the station of earth and spending eternity with God. Jesus is the only way. And that's a foundational belief. You can't be a Christian if you don't believe that. And so the question that I think it begs for us to consider this weekend is if Jesus is the only way, he's the only train leaving the station of earth and going to heaven, then how do we get on board the Jesus train? Like, what does life with Jesus actually look like? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Here's what's true about the good news and about our beliefs and all that kind of stuff. The good news begins with proper belief, but it doesn't actually change your life at all if it's just something you know. There has to be kind of a change that happens in your life and in my life for the good news to actually become personal. You know this in the way that this plays out in your life. You probably know people, or maybe you would even consider yourself one of these people. You grew up in church, and you know all about God. You know what Jesus did for you, and if I and me and you, or maybe some of the people in this room were to ask you what is the good news, you could tell us what the good news is, and you could be all about the things of God. But the good news hasn't actually changed your life. You might know a lot about who God is, but you don't have a life that reflects any of the things that he says. And you know people that are like that in your life. Why? Because just knowing the good news doesn't actually change you. There has to be something that happens for that good news to really become personal in a way that it changes your life. When God asks us to step into a personal and permanent relationship with him, there's an exchange that has to happen in order for that good news that he has told us to really become personal. And honestly, it's true anytime we step into a permanent and personal relationship with anybody. I think of my wife. We had an exchange that had to take place before our marriage was codified into marriage, and our relationship really became personal and permanent. We both made exchanges. I said, honey, these are the things that I'm promising and I'm vowing to do in our relationship. And she said the same thing back. These are the promises that I'm planning on making. And although I think I got the better end of the deal in that situation, we both had an exchange to take. We both had commitments to make. And in the same way, God says there's an exchange that has to happen for this good news to become personal to you. For this good news to really affect your life, there's an exchange that has to take place. And this is what he says. The exchange that God calls us to, the good news becomes personal when we exchange our everything for his everything. The good news becomes personal when we exchange our everything for his everything. Everything that God is for everything that we are. God is prepared to offer all the things that he has promised to us in exchange for everything that we are. I don't know if you're an extreme couponer looking for a good deal, but this is the best deal you and I could ever find ever. There's an exchange that takes place, and God says, I am prepared to give you all that I have, all that I plan on promising, and all that I have promised, I will give it all to you. And what I ask in exchange is all that you are, all of me for all of him. That's the exchange. It's not like part of me for part of him. He says, no, if you're gonna make the good news personal in your life, you're gonna enter into a permanent and personal relationship with me. It takes everything that you are for everything that he is. And that's a foundational belief for Christians. In fact, the orthodox belief that we're gonna dive into this weekend and ask ourselves if we believe is this. Another way to say that exchange is that following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. That following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. Following Jesus isn't like I'll follow Jesus on Thursday night or Sunday morning. Following Jesus isn't like I'll be like half in and half out. Following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. That there's no such thing as a casual Christian. If a Christian is going to be a Christian, they're all in. The thing that Jesus calls us to is to make an all-in commitment. We don't get to say that like, I'll follow you, Jesus, when it's convenient for me in my life, but as soon as it gets a little bit hard, I'll kind of put you on the sideline and I'll come back to you again when it gets easy. We don't get to say that, Jesus, I'll follow you until I get tired of following you, and then I'll go live however I want to, and I'll probably come back to you at some point. No, following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. Jesus, I'll follow you until like the whole, I gotta confess my sin to somebody. That's gonna make me really uncomfortable. So I'm not really gonna do that. No, following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. I know that Jesus says I need to be sober-minded, and I know what he says about being a slave to sin, but I'll follow all that he says about all that other stuff. But the alcohol, man, I love alcohol, so I'm just gonna drink as much and as often as I want to. Christians don't get to say that. A life on board the Jesus train requires an all-in commitment. Do you believe that? Really? Do you believe that so much that it has affected the way that you live your life? Do you believe that even when all in means that it's going to be difficult? Even when all in means that you might have to reprioritize some things in your life? Do you believe that? Really? Because I think, honestly, if we were to sit down together, I think the thing that most of the time we actually think is this. I put it in your notes this way. We actually think that somehow we can give a percentage of what he asked and get all of what he promised. We think somehow we can work out our relationship with God on our own terms and conditions, and the terms and conditions that we've made is, God, I'll take all that you have. God, I'll take the grace and the forgiveness of sins that cost Jesus his life, and I'll give you this little part of my life in return. Or honestly, maybe you would say, I give Jesus like most of my life. That's not what Jesus asks. We think that we can give a percentage of what he asks and get all of what he promised, when the reality is that a commitment to follow Jesus requires an all-in commitment. Here's what I also know. There's probably some people here in this room this morning that like you're about ready to give up on Christianity because it's just not working for you. And I would ask you to consider, maybe the reason your Christianity is not working for you is because this is actually what you believe. You want everything that Jesus has to offer, and who wouldn't? It's an incredible invitation to a life with him. But somehow, what you actually believe is that you can give part of you for all of him. A commitment to follow Jesus requires an all-in commitment. Do you believe that? Really? What we're gonna do this weekend is dive into a passage of scripture where Jesus talks about this reality, and he makes it really clear what an all-in commitment actually looks like, what a life with him and making that all-in commitment actually means. So if you have your Bible or you have your phone, you can go to Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 25. Luke 14, starting in verse 25. Before we start in verse 25, it's really important for us to back up a little bit and recognize what Jesus has just gotten done doing before we pick it up in 25. Jesus, for a little brief period of time before this, directly before this, actually sits down with a group of people and he talks about who's invited into life with him, who is invited into the good news life. And what he says actually shocks the people that are around him, because what the people around him find out is that like everybody's invited. And not only is like just everybody generically invited, the people who are, we would often consider like the people who maybe shouldn't be invited, or the people who are kind of on the outskirts, they're especially invited. Jesus says, my invitation for you to come and have life with me and to follow me is free, and it is available to everybody. He says, if you come and follow me, I will take your sin and I will give you my perfection. I will take your pain and give you my comfort, your anxiety for my peace, your blah of life right now for my purpose, your shame that you're living in for my grace, your rags for my glory, your death for my life, your dull life for my abundant life, your scarcity for my riches. And then he says that invitation is available for everybody. And guess what? It gets even better. He says that invitation is free. You can accept it right now. You can accept it right now. That it's not going to cost you anything. In fact, what Jesus knew was that we couldn't pay for it if it did cost us something. And so he said, I know you can't pay for it anyway, so I'll pay the price for you, and all you have to do is come and follow me. But what he's going to do here in the verses that we're going to read here in just a second is he says, the invitation's free, but I want you to know what it actually looks like for you to accept that invitation. And that's where we pick it up, starting in verse 25. He says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, again, Jesus gave this grand invitation, and he said, you're all invited, come and follow me. And of course, after he says that, tons of people are like, yes, that's a good deal. I want to follow this guy. And so he's gonna address them, and this is what he says. And actually, before we read it, I wanna warn you, the phrase that he's about to use might catch you up here a little bit, but we're gonna read it and then I'll unpack it. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate their father and mother, their wife and children, their brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. If you come to me and you don't hate your father and your mother, and all the relationships that you have in your life, you cannot be my disciple. Now, here's what you need to recognize. Jesus isn't telling us that we need to directly go to all these different relationships in our life and actually like treat them with hatred. We know that that's not true. Jesus tells us all the time to love all these people and to respect them and honor them and all that kind of stuff. What he's calling out is the priority of love in the people who are coming to follow him. He says, if you're gonna come follow me, then your highest love is for me. If you're gonna come and live a life that has given an all-in commitment to me, then that includes the priority of love in your life. There's nobody else that you can love more than me. And he lists off all those people, and then he adds that pesky person at the end that makes this list way more harder. He says all those people, and then you have to even hate your own life. Your own life. Maybe you're thinking, that list is easy for me. I can give up those relationships. But even your own life? You're willing to love yourself less than you love him. Part of what Jesus is also doing in this context is he's calling out the identity of these people. In their day and age, their identity was wrapped up in all these relationships. Who their father was, who they were married to, how many kids they had, who they were connected to in life. He's saying not only is your highest priority of love in your life me, but your identity is no longer connected to any of those people either. It's connected to me. And he draws the line in the sand. And he says, if you're not willing to do that, it's not just like you're not the best Christian you could possibly be, but you're still kind of a Christian. It's not like you can't go work at a church someday or be a missionary if you don't do this. Jesus says, no, you cannot be my disciple if you're not willing to do that. That's a line in the sand. You cannot follow Jesus without an all-in commitment. And part of an all-in commitment says Jesus is the highest priority of love in my life. If I was there, I would sit down and say, Jesus, You just gave this grand invitation to follow you, and then you followed it up with this thing that's incredibly difficult. And Jesus would look back at me and look back at the crowd, and he would say, oh, you think that's tough? You just wait till the next verse, because I'm about to add some plates to this bench press. It's going to get a little tougher. And he goes on and he says this in the next verse. Maybe. Suppose one of you wants, back up one more. He says, not only do you have to have that priority of love in your life, but then he also says, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. The priority of love has to have Jesus at the top. And then he says, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now we have to recognize something that's a bias for us in our life. When we hear the word cross, we immediately think of all the things that we lump on to the cross. We see crosses everywhere. You could walk into your neighbor's house who hasn't been to church in 15 years, and they might have a cross up on their wall. People have cross tattoos and cross necklaces. People have crosses all over their Instagram pages and all that kind of stuff. Why? Because we associate now in our day and age the cross with grace and with salvation and with the freedom that's found in God and all sorts of good things. But when the people that Jesus was talking to heard the word cross come up, they had a very different idea. They hear cross and they think Roman crucifixion, which is a horrible way to die. Romans would hang people on a cross and they would choke in their own fluids, and ultimately that's how Jesus would die. And before they would hang people on a cross, oftentimes what they would do is they would hang a cross on somebody and they would say, now I need you to carry that cross to the place of your execution. So when Jesus says this, the crowd there, they think of all the people that they've seen carry a cross. And one thing they knew about all the people they've seen carry a cross is that those people are dead and gone, and they're not coming back. When someone took a cross up, when someone had a cross placed on them, they were gone. There's no coming back. And in the same way, Jesus says, you choosing to follow me means that the old way of life you used to have, the old you, is gone. And they're not coming back. There's not like I'll test drive a relationship with Jesus, but I'll still hang on to all the ways that I used to live, and I'll come back to him later. Jesus says, no, an all-in commitment to me is a commitment to say, the old you is gone, and the new you is here. And then he says, you carry your cross, and you follow him. It's not just that you're a new person, it's you're a new person following after the things of God, connected to the things of God. You take God's mission upon your life and choose to follow him. Again, you cannot be my disciple. Now, it would be easy to think at this point that Jesus is a terrible salesman here. He gives them this grand sales pitch of following him and choosing to have a life that looks like him. And then he says all these really difficult things. And I'm sure all the people are like, Jesus, I thought this was going to be easy. I thought this was going to be good. I thought I had the deal of a lifetime. And I actually think what Jesus is doing is saying, you do have a deal of a lifetime, but I'm honest. And I want you to know what you're really getting yourself into. You've probably been around somebody who has something bad to offer, and they're just trying to make a deal. They're trying to make a sale. And so what they do is they try to make the upfront price as pretty as possible, and then they bury a ton of expenses in the fees and the terms and conditions. I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, but I think of Ticketmaster, right? Ticketmaster says the concert's $35, and then you check out and it's $95, and you're like, what in the world just happened? Jesus here is doing the opposite. He's saying the thing that I have is so valuable and I've made it free for you that I want to make sure you know all of what it means to accept the invitation to follow me before you accept it. And part of what he's saying is it's going to be difficult. There's some things that you need to know before you accept the invitation to Jesus. And then he walks through in verse 28 through 32 some metaphors that would have been really easy for the people in that day and age to understand. And this is what he says. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and you're not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. What an idiot. They didn't think it through. And then he goes on in the next verse and he says this. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and he will ask for terms of peace. He says, if you ever get into any big project in your life or any grand adventure, don't you first consider the cost? Don't you first consider the cost? Don't you actually sit down and figure out what all this stuff is going to cost you? And in the same way, he is saying, I need you. If you're going to accept the grand invitation to follow me, I need you to consider the cost. And then in verse 33, he says this, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have, again, cannot be my disciple. Sometimes that's translated in those of you who are not willing to say goodbye to all that you have, cannot be my disciple. He lays out the cost again and he says, highest love, carry your cross, and say goodbye to everything that you have. He finishes up this passage of scripture by using another analogy, starting in verse 35. He says, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. He says, somebody who has made a half-hearted commitment to follow me is worthless. Somebody who thinks they can get away with being a casual Christian is not a Christian. That type of relationship with God is good for nothing. He says, if you're going to choose to follow me, it requires an all-in commitment. Do you believe that? Really? There's several things that I think Jesus is trying to get across to us here, but he really wants us to know exactly what it means for us to accept the invitation to follow him. And if we're going to kind of grasp really what he's saying in a short phrase, I think the invitation to follow Jesus is this. I put it to your notes this way, that the invitation to follow Jesus is an invitation to give it all. The invitation to follow Jesus is an invitation to give it all. And the scary thing about that phrase is that all means all. I think sometimes it can be really easy for us to hear stuff that Jesus says and like nuance it away or ignore it. But Jesus in this passage makes it abundantly clear. You, if you are going to make a commitment to follow him, have to give it all. There's no such thing as a Christian who's 1 foot in, 1 foot out, half-hearted in the way that they make a commitment to life. We wish that we could take like all the good stuff that Jesus has to offer and just add that to our life and that would be good. But Jesus says, no. I'm not an add-on to your life. I am all of your life. And if you're going to choose to follow me, it means that you have to give it all. It means that church is no longer a negotiable thing. It means that the generous life that God calls you to is no longer a negotiable thing. It doesn't mean that your kids can still be ruled by sports the way everybody else's kids are. It doesn't mean that you can like keep some skeletons in the closet once you start a relationship with Jesus and those skeletons can stay there and never get addressed. Giving it all means that you have to give it all. Do you believe that? Really? There's a ton in this passage that we could really sit down and unpack. But if we're really going to give it all, I think there's 3 kind of key things that Jesus is asking us to question. And the first one that I think Jesus is telling us to do is to ask ourselves, have we considered the cost? Have we considered the cost? Have you considered the cost of what it might cost you to be in a relationship with Jesus? And here's what Jesus is trying to get across to all of the people that hear it. He's saying the invitation to follow me is free, but there will come a point in time where it will be difficult to follow me, where it will be hard, where it will cost you something, where you might even have to sacrifice something in order to be with me. It will cost you things, and it will be difficult. But he says, remember, if you're going to say yes to getting on board the Jesus train, it requires an all-in commitment. And you can't give an all-in commitment if you don't give it all. And you can't give it all if you don't consider the cost. My wife and I love eating out. I told my wife a while ago, I'm a sucker for fancy food. We don't get to eat fancy all the time. So maybe once or twice a year, we get to go to a really fancy restaurant. And I don't know if you've ever been to a fancy restaurant that is so fancy that they don't put the prices on the menu. That's like the epitome of fancy, I think, when you just don't even have to ask how much something costs. But typically, we've gone to a restaurant like that maybe a couple times throughout our marriage. And if we're going to a place like that, more often than not, we kind of connect with somebody who's been there first, who's been there before us. And typically, my wife and I are really adventurous eaters. We're not picky at all. So if they tell us to get something while we're there or to order a certain thing, pretty much we just say, okay, that's what we're going to get. So when we go to the fancy restaurant, the price isn't on the menu. I already have the thing in my mind that I'm going to order. I'm going to get the salmon fillet or whatever. And I'll eat it and I'll enjoy it. And then inevitably, at the end of the meal, the bill comes due and I see that the salmon fillet was like $85. That makes the meal taste a little bit worse in like post after I've already consumed it. But here's what's true. If the price would have been on the menu and I knew that the salmon fillet was $85 and I still ordered it, when that bill came due at the end of the meal, I would have said, yep, I knew how much it cost. And I would have been prepared to pay the bill when it comes. And Jesus does the exact same thing to us. He says, I have something that is incredible and I want you to accept it. But I want you to know what it's going to cost, because there will come a time where the bill will come due and following Jesus will cost you something. It'll be difficult. You'll have to give something up. You'll have to reprioritize your life. And Jesus is saying you have to be willing to be ready to pay that cost when it comes. If you are a follower of Jesus, things will get difficult. And are you prepared to pay that bill when it comes? Are you prepared to reprioritize your life? Are you prepared to make some sacrifices? Are you prepared to show up and work hard as part of a local church? Are you prepared to show up and work hard while you're raising your kids in your home? Jesus says that if we're going to be Christians, we're going to be countercultural. And if you go against the grain of culture long enough, you are bound to get some splinters, and it will be painful and it will be hard. And he says, if you're going to follow me, you got to consider the cost, because there will come a time where you have to pay the bill, where it gets difficult, where you have to have a hard conversation with somebody, where you recognize that Jesus is the only way and you want other people to know that. And so you're willing to even risk your relationship with them to talk to them about Jesus. Are you willing to give it all? And you can't give it all if you don't consider the cost. Following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. So give it all. And you won't be prepared to give it all unless you've considered the cost. That's not the only thing that I think Jesus is trying to get across to us, though. I think part of also what he's trying to say is that not only do we need to consider the cost, but we also need to be prepared to do this. We need to say goodbye. We need to say goodbye. Verse 33 says, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Again, sometimes that's translated, those of you who do not say goodbye to all that you have. Following Jesus means that you have to let go of the life you used to live before you chose to follow him. And you know what that life included? A scary thing called sin. And Jesus is saying, if you are going to follow me, I want you to give it all. And part of giving it all means you say goodbye to your sin. Means you say goodbye to the way that you used to live. If you choose to follow Jesus, you don't get to talk the way you used to talk. You don't get to think the same way that you used to think. You don't get to judge certain other types of people just because that's who they are. He does not say, you get to be with me and keep all the stuff that you used to have. He says, if you follow me, you got to say goodbye. You got to say goodbye. Say goodbye to your sin. Say goodbye to the way that you used to live. I heard this illustration from one of the other pastors here at Grace, and I'll be honest, I don't know if this is a true illustration, but it gets the point across. So go with me to the Amazon jungle, all right? We're in the Amazon jungle, and there's some hunters that are hunting for monkeys. I don't even know if monkeys live in the Amazon. If they don't, just go with me through this, all right? There's some hunters that are hunting monkeys, and one of the things that they find out is that these monkeys are really attracted to shiny things. So what the hunters did was they got clear jars and they put something really shiny in the jar. So a monkey would be doing what monkeys do, going along in the jungle, and they'd find one of those jars with the shiny thing in it, and they would inevitably reach their hand in there and grab it. And the hunters knew that if the thing that was in the jar was bigger than the lid of that container, the monkeys would reach in and grab it, and then they couldn't remove their hand. And the monkeys wanted the shiny thing so bad that they wouldn't let go of it. They would just hold on to it, and they'd try to get their hand out, and they didn't recognize that like they could just let go, and that they would have their hand back and all that kind of stuff. But the hunters came along and they said, if we tie that jar to the ground, we know the monkey's gonna grab onto it. And they're gonna grab on, and they're not gonna let go, and they're gonna keep their hand in there, and then hunters can come along and do what hunters do and harvest the monkey. And the monkey loses its life because it wouldn't let go of the shiny thing that was in the jar. And in the same way, Jesus is saying, your sin in your life, the sin that you have, is like a shiny thing in a jar, and you are holding on to it, thinking that you have something really good, and you don't recognize that like sin isn't just dangerous. Sin isn't just like maybe gonna cause you some pain in your life. That your sin is gonna lead to death. And Jesus is pleading with us to say goodbye to our sin. A life with him means that we have accepted an invitation to follow him, and that requires an all-in commitment. And part of giving it all to Jesus means that you say goodbye to the sin in your life. So I have to ask you the question this weekend. Do you right now have a sin in your life that you have not said goodbye to? Maybe you have an addiction. Maybe you use some words when nobody else is around. Maybe the way that gossip just kind of flows out of your mouth is a normal thing for you. Maybe even calling back to what Jesus has said in some of these other passages, maybe you love a lot of other people more than you love God. Do you have a sin in your life right now that you need to say goodbye to? And I think one of the things that, it's kind of an aside, but it's really important for us to recognize. Sometimes we think that God's not like empathetic to how hard it can be sometimes for us to let go of our sin. But I just want to remind you, God took on skin and lived a life as Jesus perfectly and never sinned. But the Bible tells us that he was tempted in all the same ways that we are tempted. He knows how difficult it can be to come face to face with a sin and choose to follow God anyway. Jesus is saying, following me, giving it all to me, means that you say goodbye to the sin in your life. Jesus requires an all-in commitment, and we can't give it all if we don't say goodbye to our sin. The third thing that I think Jesus is calling us to in this passage is that we would do this. I put it in your notes this way, that we would carry your cross. Jesus uses that language again in this passage to talk about the reality that the old you is dead and gone. But he says, if you're gonna carry your cross, part of carrying your cross means that you pick it up and you follow me. That you follow me. That it's not just like I bear this weight because I bear this weight and I'll just stand here. Jesus says, no, carrying your cross means that you follow after me, that you take my weight upon you and you have my mission as front and center of your life moving forward. Carrying your cross also means that you are missional to the thing that God would call you to be missional to. The old you is gone, so carry your new weight as a follower. I think a lot of times what we can kind of get in trouble with is we think that like our relationship with Jesus is like the end goal of Christianity. Like once we're saved by God and we enter into that permanent and personal relationship with Jesus, then like we've accomplished it. It's done, yay, I'm a Christian now. And there's nothing else for me to do. But Jesus tells us the moment you become a Christian, you have a new mission in your life. Part of Jesus' mission is to go and make disciples of all nations and baptize them and tell them what it means to follow him. Part of Jesus' mission means that you're connected to a local church and you're furthering God's heart to reach the world through the local church. If you are going to say yes to follow Jesus, then you have to carry your cross. And part of carrying your cross means that you take his mission upon you in your life. I played a ton of basketball growing up. It was my main sport. I played multiple seasons a year. I know another basketball guy is just what our church needs. But I played a ton of basketball. So I was super familiar with the tryout process to make it on new teams. I wasn't familiar with it because I never made the teams. I was familiar with it because I was on a bunch of teams growing up. And one of the things that's true of the tryout process for basketball is that it's oftentimes preceded by a thing called open gym. Open gym is just an opportunity for everybody to kind of play pickup basketball however they want to. And a lot of times what people do in open gym is they flaunt like the best way that they know how to play. So there's inevitably the guy in open gym who's a shooter. And all he does is he gets in the corner and he sits there and he shoots threes. And he hardly gets back on defense. He just cherry picks until his teammates pass him the ball and he sits in the corner and he shoots threes. And he does it that way because he wants the coaches to know that he can shoot, that he's gonna have the highest three-point percentage on the team. And ultimately, if he's a good enough three-point shooter, he'll probably make the team. And if it's a good team and if it's a good coach, there will come a time where that player makes the team and the coach sits them down and he says, hey, I know you played however you wanted to in open gym, but now that you're on the team, if you just play that way, that's actually a really selfish thing to do. Now that you're on the team, I need you to hustle back on defense even when you don't want to hustle. Now that you're on the team, you got to pass the ball when your teammates are open because they're just as valuable as you are. But also, now that you're on the team, I need you to shoot, and I need you to make a lot of points, and I need you to be successful in that. But you getting to play however you want to play is not an option anymore. That's a selfish way to play, and I need you to not play selfish basketball. Jesus says the same thing to us. He says, now that you're on the team, now that you're with me, you don't get to play selfish anymore. You get to be about the things that I need you to be about. Are you committed to God's call enough that you would really take it seriously that he tells us to talk to people about him? Are you committed to God's call? Are you prepared to give it all, even if it means you're going to have a hard conversation with a family member about who Jesus really is to you? Part of living a Christian life and accepting Jesus' invitation to follow him means that you give it all. Are you prepared to give it all? By carrying your cross, by taking his mission upon you, even when it's difficult, by being connected to a local church, by sacrificing, by volunteering for the things that God calls you to be about. When was the last time you actually had a Jesus-centered conversation with a non-Christian? When was the last time you went on a mission trip? When was the last time, if other people would affirm that you're ready for this, that you took someone younger than you under your wing and discipled them? Carrying your cross means that you take Jesus' weight upon you and you're part of his mission, and you can't give it all if you're not willing to carry your cross. Jesus requires an all-in commitment. And you can't make an all-in commitment if you don't give it all. So consider the cost, say goodbye to your sin, and carry your cross. I think it can be easy in this conversation to just let it be like maybe analytical in the way that we think, but not really affect our life. So I want to help us out by giving a really practical action step this weekend. Our action step homework assignment is to identify one area of your life that you have not given all of what he asks. That you would identify an area in your life right now that you have not given all that he asks. Maybe for you, there is a sin in your life. Maybe for you, you need to reprioritize your family schedule and the things that you say you're about. Maybe for you, you need to have a gospel conversation with a family member. Maybe for you, you need to come to church more often. You need to read your Bible. Whatever it is, ask yourself, look in the mirror, what's an area of my life that I have not given all of what Jesus asks? And then, simply put, give it all. Give it all. And I know that that's like a cliche thing to say and that it's a lot harder than that, but what Jesus calls us to is so much better than anything we're holding on to. So ask yourself, where have I not gone all in? Where have I not actually taken the step to give it all to Jesus? And then give it all. I also think it's easy in this conversation to just ask man, why would we do this? The life Jesus calls us to is difficult. It's hard. It'll cost us something. We'll have to sacrifice. And Jesus calls us to give it all, but here's what's true. Jesus is not calling us to do something that he has not first done for us. Amen. In fact, your last note is this. Would you let his unconditional love inspire unconditional surrender to you? That when you look to really understand what Jesus has done, that you would recognize that Jesus left heaven in the comforts of a perfect relationship with his Father, came to our crummy place that we have messed up, lived a perfect life, died the death that we deserve, and he did it all knowing that you and I would make half-hearted commitments to follow him. He knew, he went to the cross while we were sinners. Before we ever said, yes, Jesus, I'm in. He went and he did all that, had a crown of thorns shoved on his head, suffocated in his own fluids, had a spear shoved through his side, and died for you and me, knowing that we would be half in, half out for him. That we would see everything that he has done and his unconditional love for us, and we would say, here's a little part of me, Jesus. Here's a little percentage of my life. Would you look at what he did? And honestly, we have an opportunity to do this in just a few weekends as we reflect on Easter and all that that means. Would you really consider his unconditional love? And would you allow it to inspire an unconditional surrender that says, Jesus, I know the exchange that you're asking for is all of you for all of me. And I'm prepared to make an all-in commitment by giving it all. There's a phrase that's kind of been running through my head as I've been just preparing for this talk and thinking about it. It's a phrase I heard a long time ago. I honestly don't remember where I heard it. Might have been in a book, might have been from a sermon, might have been from somebody else on staff here at Grace. The phrase that's been resonating with me, though, is this: that the most miserable place for a human to find themselves is to be a Christian with one foot in the things of God and one foot in the things of the world. The most miserable place for a person to find themselves is to be a Christian with one foot in the things of God and one foot in the things of the world. Why? If you have one foot in the things of God and you know enough about what God says to know that He's the only thing that will ever satisfy your deepest desires. And if you've got one foot in the things of the world, and you've got just enough stock left in the things that are not about God to be unsatisfied. Jesus tells us to make an all-in commitment, mostly because He deserves an all-in commitment, and partly because He knows that anything less than giving it all is a miserable place for us to live. Following Jesus requires an all-in commitment. Do you believe that? Really? Father God, I'm thankful for what you've done. God, I'm first and foremost thankful that this message and what you tell us in Luke chapter 14 has been convicting to me personally. God, I pray for everybody that's listening to this right now, that they would sit down, look in the mirror, and say, do I really believe that following you requires an all-in commitment? And if they don't, God, I pray that you would meet them right where they're at, that you would show them your unconditional love and all the work that you have done to be in a relationship with us, knowing that we would make half-hearted commitments to follow you. And I pray that when they see that unconditional love, they would be inspired to unconditionally surrender to you. God, the life that you invite us into is a beautiful life. Life abundantly. But we can only accept the invitation if we're prepared to give it all. So would we consider the cost? Would we say goodbye to our sin? And would we carry our cross and follow you? God, more than anything in this conversation, I pray that we would do our best to look more like you, that we would recognize your love, and that would lead us to be Christians who are about the good news and who make all-in commitments to follow you. God, we love you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.